Thank you. Well, welcome to our third episode for the Talk Out Talk Shed podcast. It's been a while, brewing for a while, so I'm so excited to have. This is the first time we're doing a panel, and I have a very distinguished gentleman with me today. So we're excited about this topic we're going to be covering today. Basically, we're talking about decentralization, and the reason I wanted to do this topic is after the John Mommy's interview, there was a bit of a stir in the water, and it got me curious and excited about this topic of decentralization, especially after Dr. John Mommy's covered the original thinking of the CPC in terms of decentralization. And one of the comments he made at that interview was that we've come full circle. And he was trying to allude to the fact that we have kind of returned to the way we were governed pre-independence, in other words, by the colonizers, where everything is centralized. And so that comment for me, it struck a chord because, all right, we've now recolonized ourselves in a different way. It's like Waigani is recolonizing Papua New Guinea, is colonizing Papua New Guinea. So, and then Emmanuel put out a good reflection on the principle of subsidiarity, which for me was the first time I heard that term from Dr. John Mommy's in that interview, and I thought, oh, that was an interesting concept. Anyway, so I reached out to Dr. Thomas Webster, who is one of our panelists today, and then he reached out to Mr. Tamutai and Mr. Pokawin, and I will read their credentials as a way of introduction. My guest co-host today is Mr. Emmanuel E.Narokobi, Managing Director of Masalai Communications, an all-round social commentator on all things Papua New Guinea. And so thank you, Manu, for joining us this morning. All right, now let me go through Dr. Thomas Webster's credentials, which are very vast, very colorful. Currently, Dr. Webster is a professional research fellow here at the NRI. He served as a director at the National Research Institute from August 2004 to June 2015, where he retired. Before that, he was, his current affiliations, I'd like to just cover them very quickly. He's a member of the Council for the Innovative University of Enga. He's a director and chair of the board for PNG Dataco Limited. He's a member of the Council of the IDS University, a member of the Council for the Divine Word University, member and chair of the board for the Kuli St. Michael Technical and Vocational School in Jiwaka Province. His past experiences include trustee director of the #1 Super Commissioner Bougainville Referendum Commission, chair and board member of the Independent Public Business Corporation of PNG, from now KCHL, Kumul Consolidated. So yeah, very experienced in terms of the directorships and general leadership in Papua New Guinea. His professional qualification, he's got a degree in a Doctor of Education from the University of Bristol, United Kingdom, a postgraduate certificate in Economics, Institute of Economics, University of Colorado at Boulder, USA, degree of a Master's of Education from Harvard University, USA, degree of Bachelor of Education from UPNG, a Diploma in Education Studies, UPNG, and a certificate in Primary School Teaching at Holy Trinity Teachers College. And so at that time, he was Mr. Webster, he worked as a teacher. He's been a headmaster and then worked his way up to Assistant Policy Officer at the National Department of Education, and eventually in 1998 to 2001 served as the Provincial Administrator for the Western Highlands Province. So served for about 3 years and 9 months. So this is one of the reasons we have brought Dr. Webster to the panel to give us some of his experience as well as his research expertise to this topic. So thank you, Dr. Webster, and welcome to the podcast. Now, our next panelist, again, like I said, they're all very colorful gentlemen we have here this morning. Our next panelist is Mr. Matthew Tamutai. Mr. Matthew Tamutai is a lawyer by profession, has been a lawyer since 1980. So long before I was born, he was a lawyer, and so I'm so grateful for his presence here. Mr. Tamutai worked as Provincial Legal Officer for the Southern Highlands Provincial Government between 1985 and 1994, both as a Provincial Legal Officer and then as a private lawyer later on in life. And then he has been working with provincial governments in the country. He did his private practice, Tamutai Lawyers, based in Mount Hagen, and was engaged by the provincial government of the Southern Islands, the Anga, the Western Highlands Province, and Fly River provincial government. So a lot of legal input he has had into these provincial governments, and so I'm so grateful that he's with us today. And one of his landmark cases is the Supreme Court reference against the state of emergency against the Southern Islands province that he argued in front of a Supreme Court bench in 2006 to have that state of emergency declared unconstitutional, and he was successful, and so that SOE was declared by the Supreme Court to be unconstitutional. And he has since been working with provincial governments and business houses, business arms of provincial governments, advising and so on. So thank you, Mr. Tamutai, for joining us this morning as well. Now, the next guest panelist on our show today is none other than Mr. Stephen Pokawin. Mr. Pokawin is currently a lecturer, a senior lecturer at the University of Papua New Guinea, a senior lecturer at the law school. He's got an LLB in honors at the UPNG in 2007, and I'm happy to say I was classmates with him on one or two courses before he graduated in 2007. I graduated 2008, and but before that he got a master's MA from the Master of Arts from the McGill University in Montreal, Canada, a Bachelor of Arts at the University of PNG, and Bachelor of Honors at the UPNG, and a Bachelor of Arts at the UPNG. So yeah, he was one time president of the National Alliance Party. He was chancellor for the University of Papua New Guinea between 2007 and 2015. And so even though we were classmates at UPNG, when I was graduating we were also classmates at Legal Training Institute, 2007. And when we came back this is an interesting fact, when we came back for graduation, we were being handed our certificates by Mr. Pokawin himself. So that was good, because we would come and give him shoulder bumps at the presentation. He's been an advisor to the Office of the Prime Minister, Secretary General for the National Alliance Party. But the key things that we're interested in Mr. Pokawin about are in 1997 to 2002, he was provincial member for Manus and therefore provincial governor of Manus. And he was in the transition periods, which we will come to today, 1996 to 97, open member for Manus and interim governor for Manus province. So I was at the interim period after the 1995 organic law. But before that, 1985 to 1995, you were premier for Manus provincial government. So we are getting the best of both worlds, at least the premier days of our decentralization reforms, and the later on as governor under the new system of government we had. So that's some of the credentials of the distinguished gentlemen we have today. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. All right. Now, we are going to be, this discussion today, we're going to be covering the evolution of the decentralization of powers, or decentralization of government in Papua New Guinea. We start a bit with the pre-colonial days and, just a short snippet of how did we govern ourselves as small villages and tribes and clans. And then we talk a bit about the colonization era, which is pre-independence, where we were under different European rulership. And then we look into the independence days as well, the early days, and then the first constitutional amendment, the first law that covered provincial governments, and then we look at the reform that came in 1995. So with that, that's our rundown of what we're doing, and there's a little introduction. Gentlemen, how are you all this morning?
Pretty good, thank you. Thank you for this.
Well, it's been exciting. We've had a few coffee meetings before this, and we've kind of talked about some things, but I would like to start with Dr. Webster in terms of generally just some historical understanding of the pre-colonial, and maybe you can go into the colonial days of, you know, the leadership and governance systems, if you could call them, that we had in our villages and our, you know, pre-colonization days.
Maybe if I could sort of say, what are the key phases in the evolution of the thinking around decentralization, and then you could come in at different times to sort of say the pre-colonization, how these societies organize ourselves, and then to the colonization. So I think that for our purposes, there are probably about 5 different phases, as you put it. The pre-colonization, how did we sort of organize ourselves, and how did we live as in our traditional societies? And of course, then the colonial government period. The colonial government came much later. I think if you look at the history, the colonies, the UK, the British government established the colonies in the US, and of course in India and the other in Africa and so on. What they did was they sent out companies, and the royals gave the mandates to the companies to go and do business, and they gave the permission also to run the government systems in there. They sent their representatives as administrators to take care of the governance issues, while the main focus was really to sort of see what the resources there and the economic benefits that they could derive. And so a lot of the governance arrangements for basic service delivery was shared between those entities, the government, like the British India Company, as they say, in India, that sort of did the business, did the road transport systems and so on, shipping and so on, and then they reported on the governance issues to those. So the similar thing happened in PNG, but in the Pacific, we were divided like the German New Guinea. New Guinea was, the colonial authorities divided up all West Papua to the Dutch, on the other side of New Guinea, the southern was the British, and then the Germans and the New Guinea. So later on, the exit of those entities, and now we were sort of left with the Australians as a trusteeship council looking after Australia, the Papua and the New Guinea territories. And so that's when the Australians then sent the administrator who was appointed to look at and administer the trustee territory of New Guinea, which included Papua and New Guinea. So the administrator set up the office down at Konidobo, and the Legislative Assembly was set up in the 1960s. A few representatives were sort of elected from our regions, I think, which considered the first Legislative Assembly in 1964. Before that, I think they also had like Kondo Magwando and a few people from the regions were elected, which were basically a consulting sort of a body. Right. And the administrator, they were appointed by Canberra, and they sort of ran the affairs of the country. Yeah. Of course, at that time, at the colonial government, in the districts, the provinces were then called districts, and there were district commissioners in those sort of areas. So all the districts had, so they were like, they administered everything. But in terms of the consultative assemblies, they had the national sort of House of Assembly, the Legislative Assembly, and the House of Assembly later on. But at the local level, at the provincial level, they established the local level government councils. So the local level government councils were quite sort of, based on the British and the Australian experience, they were sort of setting up markets, making decisions about cleaning up, carrying rubbish away and so on. So they were sort of managing those sort of things. But they were more or less a consultative body. At the provincial level, the area authorities later on into the 70s and 80s, I think, where the representatives from each of the councils were then appointed to this area authority. They provided as an advisory body to the district commissioner, which of course I think later on they were at the time of independence, they were the constitutional sort of body for development of the provincial constitutions, the area authorities. a few things. So that was the colonial administration until, and everything, all the laws were passed by Canberra. I mean, the House of Assembly, you had the members from the different electors across the country, but you had the administrator and all his advisors, all the heads of departments were also members of the House of Assembly. They were there. So it's really it's like consultative assembly. They centralized, heavily centralized governance arrangement system. Of course, then the pressure for independence from across the globe, and so into the 50s and 60s, the movement for independence, and of course, PNG was also part of that. And we sort of had the Constitutional Planning Committee that, Samari was the chair, but Momis was the deputy chair and de facto the working chair of the Constitutional Planning Committee, which then presented their report. And then the House of Assembly then reconsidered as sort of, I think, the constitutional, the Assembly to sort of approve the Constitution. And it is at that point that the CPC did a piece on decentralization, and and if you look at the Constitution, it talks about a heavily sort of decentralized system of government, the Constitution plan. Mohammed, and they were heavily sort of wanted to push that agenda, but in the time that they were working on the Constitution, they felt that, for two things. One, where they said that it was going to really empower the provinces, and the Constitutional Planning Committee was that decentralized system of government under a unitary system. The unitary system, PNG, as a united nation country, but having greater powers in the provinces. And some people felt that if we leave the provinces to have more powers, they might become too powerful, and they might want to secede. And at that time, you had Papua Besenada talking about seceding from Papua. Bougainville very strong in terms of their own aspirations. Matongan Association. So they left that piece out. So when they passed the Constitution, they left the bit on decentralization out of the Constitution. And it's at that point that the Bougainvilleans, they said, no, they're going to secede from the country, and so, which they unilaterally declared their independence. And so the government, Samari was the first prime minister, and the executive government of PNG, they agreed to, in the negotiations with Bougainville, to bring back that decentralization. And they then passed it as the organic law on President. Stephen and Matthew can talk a little bit about that, because that really sort of weakened the whole thing about the implementation of a decentralization system, as the Constitutional Planning Committee said. So that was at independence, this thing about key things around decentralization. But then in 1976, that the organic law on provincial government was approved in 1996, 97, and then they started to implement it by 1998. And the thinking then at that time when the Constitutional Planning Committee was to have a phased-in implementation, that they would, each province, as they were ready, they would then negotiate with the central government to sort of have discuss the arrangements and then agree to what sort of decentralized. Decentralization is basically sharing of powers. What powers do you have to look after people, and what powers are retained at the central level to sort of look at what the overall. So it's about those negotiations that should take place. But what happened was that I think McKinsey and company, they advised the government to say, let everybody, all the provinces implement it nationwide. And so they went ahead, and everybody was told to develop a constitution and have a provincial government system that got implemented in 1976. Of course, that then, we had problems. People didn't like whether we can talk about that later. Yeah. And then the 1995. So the national government felt that they needed to change that, and the 1995 organic law on provincial and local level government was the other big reform that came in, which then re-centralized everything.
Re-centralized.
Yeah. 1976 was decentralization of powers. 1995, re-centralization of powers, which is the main distinction between those two things as I see it. Of course, there's one sort of period that we need to also talk about when we come. It's the 2014 DDA, District Development Authority. With the implementation of the 1995 reforms got a little off skew because of the 2014. And so just one final point is that when we talk about decentralization, it's not only about the provinces and the local level governments, it's also about how the national government is also the powers and functions of the national government, because it's really about how all the governance system is arranged. What powers and functions are retained by the central government, how effective do they run it, what are the powers and functions that are decentralized to the different levels of subsidiary governments.
So in terms of the, like from what you said, the main, what do you call them, landmarks in our decentralization journey, we have Independence Day. Okay, let's count, okay, colonialization government, that's done now. So we had Independence Day, but that period of no provincial governments, I suppose, that was only for 12 months or so. 1976, we have the organic law on provincial governments being enacted, and that's when the system, before the current system, under the current organic law, and that's where Mr. Pokawin, your days of premier days and the premiers of each province. So we have that second period under the first organic law on provincial governments, and then now we have the third period, I suppose. It's more second proper period under the second organic law, which is the organic law on provincial governments and local level governments. That was 1995. And then the tweak, that we call it the tweak period, is in 2014 when DDAs were created under the relevant act, the DDA Act, I think it's called, and then that has changed a bit in terms of the system of government. So those are the major periods we are looking at today. But I want to go back to talking about just those days, the CPC days. What were the major thoughts around the general system of government that we have in Papua New Guinea in regards to the national system and the provincial governments or districts at that time before they became provinces? What was the general thought by the CPC and or the other members of the House of Assembly or otherwise general thinkers at that time? Mr. Pokawin?
Yeah, maybe I'll just continue from where Dr. Webster had started. You really cannot talk about CPC without the context within which it came into existence. Mm-hmm. The context has been described generally as a colonial period. But within that period, a transformation had taken place which had converted a land of many tribes into some kind of an entity. It wasn't PNG. It was just a whole lot of many different groupings. And this is where the colonial period was a transformative period. Without it, there couldn't have been PNG. Without it, if there was another kind of administration, we would have been a country from the Bed's Head in West PNG, in West Papua, to Samarai. Mm-hmm. The infamous from Samarai to, there's a song. Mm-hmm. That would have been a country of its own, the entire country. But the circumstances were such that the entire place was divided into three parts. West Papua, Papua, New Guinea, and then we have West Papua, which became Indonesia, and the other side, which became Papua New Guinea as we know it today. So that's a very important factor that needs to be taken into account. Without it, we could be talking about anything. CPC came in. But when CPC came in and it began doing its work, one of the outcomes was that the colonial PNG and the transition period was basically one of the most centralized, administrative, bureaucratic system that was found to be anywhere within the region. Very, very centralized. So this is where the idea of decentralization came in. There were, of course, factors which contributed towards the focusing on decentralization as an opposite to a centralized system that we have had. I think the CPC talked about converting, it may be in my own words, but converting subjects into citizens. Subject to the colonial administration, you and I, our parents, our ancestors. They were basically beneficiary of the dishing out of government, of law and order, of economy, of the church by the administration. And decentralization became something like something different from what it was before. So I think decentralization should be seen in that context, converting from a very centralized administration into a decentralized, giving authority back to the people. But those people were not Papua New Guineans. Those people were from the many different groupings that had prior existed. So we need basically to transform a diverse composition of a grouping into a nation. I think that's what I can say. And you go back to the Constitution and everything is set out in the preamble of the Constitution. It's concise. Mm-hmm. And at the beginning, we, the people, give ourselves all these things. We give ourselves the Constitution. We give ourselves the country. This is what we grant ourselves. But before that, we must become that people. And this is where decentralization is not just a system of government. It's an attempt to create a people. And to give them that power. And the Constitution begins by saying that the people are the source of power. But that power has been given to someone else. And who is that someone else? That someone else is, of course, the national government. And in the transition period, they gave that to the elected representatives. And the elected representatives spoke on their behalf to create that constitution, to give themselves that constitution, and to give themselves their country, that nation. And so that is a context within which we see the work of the CPC. And CPC, in fact, one of the most important documents that everybody should have access to is the CPC report.
Agreed.
Yeah. It is essential, and now it is almost difficult to find. And then, of course, the Constitution. And laws, we can talk about it later. But CPC captures the thinking of the constitution makers. And they didn't just come up with it. There was a major consultative process that went right across the country. It's unimaginable. And they were able to do it without the kind of luxury that we have now. Roads, boats, planes, they did it. And the system that supported them was, again, unimaginable. And this is a colonial structure that enabled the Kiaps to basically walk the walk right across the length and breadth of PNG. That was within the system at that point in time. So when we look at the magnitude of work that was done to create the transition from being a colonial lot of people to an independent PNG, it's a huge task. And I think this is one of the major, not an era, but we've transited from some kind of idea into some kind of idea, and we have basically forgotten about our history. Mm-hmm. When they decided, in fact, even though the CPC had the idea that there will be a transitional period in which provincial government is not made readily available to everybody. You must earn it. There must be the background that you have to have met in order for you to be granted provincial governments. I think it's more like you give him all, you must give him me too. I can't wait. So the pressure from within basically led to a basic process was this: is you must first have your own constitution. So what Dr. Webster referred to as the area authority, where it existed, became the interim provincial governments. Okay. And it was during that interim provincial government stage that the constitution of the provincial government was made.
And this was after Independence Day.
It was after independence. 76, 77? So a constitution, so this is one of the major features of the provincial government in that period. Every province had a constitution. Every province. Without a constitution, you would never have the provincial government. So when your constitution and administration, of course, provided the template, and each of the, what is equivalent to the Constituent Assembly, the constitution maker, then came up with their respective constitution. So you have every province has its own flag, it has their own songs, it has their own everything, it has its own the name of their provincial assembly, and all these things. That was part of the constitution at that period of time. So there really has not been any what do you call gap. There has always been some kind of an administration,
Right.
from colonial administration through to now. So this is where the interim phase comes in. And in 1995, as soon as the parliament repealed the previous organic law and brought in the organic law on provincial governments and local level governments, all the provincial governments now that had existed at that time with premiers and so on became an interim new provincial government under the new organic law. And this is where the premiers were relegated to interim deputy governors.
So you went from departments to, there were initially departments in the 80s and 90s, the provincial governments.
No, the departments is a colonial category. New Guinea was a during the colonial period category. In the 1960s, after the war, in fact, when the United Nations replaced the League of Nations, and Australia had continued to be the administrative authority since end of World War I. You see, previous to that, Papua was British, New Guinea was German. After the war, it became Papua and New Guinea. Yeah. And that is when Australia became the representative of the League of Nations that governed both the territory of Papua and the territory of New Guinea. And that continued until after the war, when Australia then got that mandate, not from from the League of Nations, but it became United Nations mandate. Mm-hmm. But Australia had continued to administer PNGs through Angawa during the war period. And after that, with United Nations, Australia continued, and after the 64 Parliament, when Australia was encouraged, like any other colonial authority, to prepare to decolonize. Mm. And this is where PNG also became part of that. But let me leave that at that. When we became independent, Papua and New Guinea ceased to exist. Mm. It now became the country, the nation of Papua and New Guinea. They decided to maintain the name, but remove the N. So Papua New Guinea is an independent idea. What existed before was Papua and New Guinea. And that's where the Owen Stanley Range divides what we have now. Right. Yeah. So, but I talked too long, but let me just insert this other thing. We had the provincial government decentralization from 1976, 77 to 1995. Mm-hmm. And then we have the 1995 to now, which is the provincial government and local level government. And that's a significant distinction, because it brought in the whole idea of Papua New Guinea as one independent country. Yeah. And then we have provincial government up to 1995. Local level government was the subject that provincial government will deal with. If they want it, they make it. If they don't want it, they accept what the national government gave them. If not, no local level government. But 95 until now, we have these two as the symbiotic twins. At the moment, since 1995, provincial government really does not exist. in my mind. The name exists. But when you look at the entire process, you must first have the national government, and you must first have the local government, and then they combine to form the provincial government. That's what we have now. So national government, we have election in 2022. And local level government had continued the way it was prior to 2022. And they're now having elections in this September, I'm told, when the writs will be issued. So the members of the Provincial Assembly, who are now in provincial government, existed well before the 2022 authority that was given by the Constitution. So those are remnants of the previous election. They continue now. An election comes in September, finishes in December, and they continue for 5 years. So there is the transition. So without LLG and without national government, there cannot be provincial government. They don't have an independent standing. Their standing exists because of the pre-existence of provincial government. And that is where Momi says, return to centralization. And that's very important. Let me just finish with this. This is a little bit out of the way, but it is in the Constitution, so we cannot ignore it. And that is part 14.
We'll come to that. Part 14 being the amendments on the provincial government.
No, it was not an amendment. It was an insertion of a new arrangement.
Right.
Because it applies only to Bougainville.
Yeah.
It applies only to Bougainville, but it is in the PNG Constitution. And it is stated very clearly that it applies only to Bougainville and no other. But it is in the PNG Constitution. Anyhow, I'll end there.
Yeah. I wanted to just touch back on, sorry, Mr. Tamutai, you wanted to add something?
Yes. Just do some fit-ins here from what the conversation so far. It's all about autonomy. We had it in our societies already, in our villages, everywhere. So when the thinking came along, and most of it was the CPC sort of rode on the Bougainville influence, and that was an excellent. We must, congratulate Bougainvilleans for that, and also Dr. Momis, because if you really see it, it's about us, Papua New Guineans. We make our own decisions in our own villages and all that. So they were trying to get us on this, and I take the analogy of a railroad tracker. You see, we were already off the railroad track when we were colonized, and this concept of decentralization brought us back on the track, and the traction was continuing. And as we went, and then of course in 1995, I will not repeat what my friends have said, but we went off track again. But there was one intervention in 1974, the Provincial Government Preparatory Arrangements Act, 1974. Because of this, the CPC said that there was a yearning for, exercise of powers by the people themselves. So that was one of the impetus of coming up with the decentralization and provincial government system. So in 1974, some area authorities, as mentioned earlier, were trying to wanted to get provincial government, and Bougainville was one of them, and they recognized them as provincial government. They named them as provincial government under that act. They didn't have much powers, but just to have recognitions as provincial governments. So, like you have Western Province, they gazetted them and called Western Province provincial government. Once they got their constitution, as Pokawin has just mentioned, they then develop their own names and emblems and seal and all these things under the provincial constitution. Yeah. So some of those districts or area authorities then became provincial governments under the Preparatory Arrangements Act. But they did not have powers to exercise and all that, but just to recognize, yeah. So that was one of the things that happened there before 1975, before the organic law came into being. But if you see the Constitution is it's there now under Section 187C, subsection 5, I think, where there must be devolution of substantial decision-making powers. It's the decision-making powers we are talking about. That's pivotal. That's the whole concept that we are talking about now, and that is the thing we have gone away from with the new reforms. Maybe I'll leave it there. Yes.
That's a good segue into this question about, like, in terms of the powers, we kind of need to define when we're talking about what is supposed to be or what is a national power or national governance power. And then you have the provincial. What are the actual devolution of powers or the actual powers that were supposed to be given away and what was supposed to be retained by the national government if we have an ideal setting of a decentralized system of government?
Perhaps that's where this principle of subsidiarity comes in.
Yeah.
The principle of the notion of subsidiarity is that where it's going to affect people, the people need to make the decisions themselves, and give them that power and responsibility to make those decisions, the things that affect them. And I think that's the principle of decentralization. With the local level governments, what are the things that you can do at the local level? Give you the responsibility to make the decisions. Like when we're talking about our traditional societies, people made their own decisions about where to garden, which land to use, how to do it, when to do it, so those sort of things. So in terms of now, and going back to the Constitution, we surrendered we surrendered our rights to the Constitution, to the PNG state, and we accepted the Constitution.
We, as in the small tribes in the villages?
As small tribes and as individuals. As individuals, we surrendered.
That was a social contract that we entered into.
Exactly, and then we elect our representatives to represent us in Parliament to make the laws and to elect the executive government and let the executive government do the administration and hold them to account for managing our affairs. So I think that's an important principle that we say. What powers are retained at the national level, and what powers do they surrender to us so that we make the decisions on the things that affect our own lives. Yeah. So I think that principle of subsidiarity is important because that applies across the world. I mean, in Australia, for instance, the local level government, they provide bus transports, the local level governments. They look at, for transporting kids to school, to the markets, where do they build their stores and shops, planning at the local level. And then the state governments, they take responsibility for things that can't be dealt with at the local level. They do it at the state. And then the national state sort of looks at international and overall sort of the broader things that its community cannot organize itself.
Sure.
So things that the communities can organize, we can empower them to do those things, and things that the next level, local level government can organize. So how do you now give them that responsibility to make those decisions that will affect the people's, their outcomes? And I think that principle of subsidiarity should be the background to the way we think about decentralizing powers. What powers and functions do you give to people to make sure that they make those decisions that affect them?
Can I just speak a bit on that with the subsidiarity? So it's a concept that was developed by the Catholic Church, by Pope Pius XI, I think, in 1931. And obviously the Catholic Church was looking at it in terms of how they manage the churches across the world, from the local parish priest doing what they can, and then when they need more assistance, then they go to the Archbishop and so forth. But to make the distinction is that decentralization focuses on like the broader transfer of powers, political powers, budgetary powers, and so forth. Subsidiarity, it's sort of like a component of it where it emphasizes the appropriateness of the decision making. So it's interesting that you gentlemen have mentioned Bougainville being the driver of the concept of decentralization for PNG. So if I'm understanding correctly, it's that if Bougainville hadn't put their hand up, we would have just become a centralized country all along from the beginning and maybe become like a dictatorship or something. I don't know. But but it's interesting I say that because now that we're coming back and talking about subsidiarity, is that as a flavor of decentralization, this is exactly what Alan Bird is talking about right now, like in terms of the provincial grants. So it's like in terms of like every province should be given the grants without any question, and money blown, they get it, and then they budget for what they need to, without anything. But and the subsidiarity in terms of the appropriateness, that that influences, or it's sort of like the roadmap for subsidiarity in terms of going down that path. So like to put it into practical terms for people, so like we've got this road construction happening at the moment, like the PNG Connect. And this is what I wrote on Facebook and sort of discussed. But what we're saying, what the examples for people to understand is that, okay, if the national government has implemented the PNG Connect road construction, okay, they can get together the budget, but in following the principle of subsidiarity, they can't be selecting the construction companies or everything. That has to come right down at the provincial level. Like the ward councillor down at the village has to say, okay, mi plug adisla road la stratem disla number. Okay, budget la PNG Connect, where's that in now? Where's that for us to take care of what we can? At the moment now, we'll use people in the village and we'll work on it and everything. And then next level up, okay, we know we can't do that. Provincial government will bring in the trucks and everything. And so that's the way that if we were applying subsidiarity, that's the way that PNG Connect should be running. Is that all? Yeah, at that like local level going up, not the national government selecting the contractor and then contractor coming down and then building a 100-meter road for 5 million kina or whatever the price is, that sort of thing. So just to clarify, in terms of decentralization, is like decentralization looks at the separation of powers and budgets and so forth, but subsidiarity is about the appropriateness of it.
Exactly, and I think that's where we'll come to. Sort of, when you think about it, and then we look at the 1976 organic law on provincial and local level, how that was administered. At the political level, each of the constitutions, I think there were 4 provinces that had the president or the premier elected across the province. As others, they elected their provincial representatives, they had the electorate, and then they elected the provincial assembly, and the assembly then elected their premier. And that was the government. Then the executive government premier with the ministers, and then the public servants. There was a bit of a tussle, and Matthew might talk a little bit about that, but there's a struggle between the national government public servants who thought that they had more control over the provincial public service and so on. But it was clear that the provincial government, I think there was a court case that said that the provincial governments had the authority to appoint the secretary and the head of the public service. Yeah, but that was the arrangement. So in terms of the subsidiarity sort of issue, they described the powers and functions into 3 categories. One was all those powers and powers that are primarily provincial, and the provincial government could make laws on those. Those are the areas which, under that principle, we say, you know what best to do, so you make those laws and does it. There are other areas which said, no, the national government will focus on. Those are primarily national functions. And then there were ones in between, which both the national government and the provincial governments could, and they were sort of the, what did they call them? Concurrent functions. So the national laws were more prevailing. If there was a national law, then the national law was prevalent. But if the province passed a law, there was no national law, and the provincial government, then they could pass laws. So that's how they shared the powers and functions between. It's not about decentralizing or from the national powers down, it's sharing our powers. I think that's the concept because decentralizing is a concept coming with the colonial government. See, the colonial government was appointed by the queen, and they sort of gave the powers, but they could also take them back at any time they wanted. Whereas those powers under the Constitution, they were strengthened through the organic laws, so that if you wanted to change, it was a bit difficult, the organic laws. And that's why the separation of the powers and functions, that the powers that can be decentralized can be performed more effectively at the provincial level. Now, what Stephen was saying about the local level government councils, I think at that period in time, there's some provinces that were quite small. And the sort of local level governments, you probably didn't need those provinces. The provincial government would deliver those services and make those decisions. But the other provinces might be quite large, so they might want to establish local level governments as another tier to sort of make rules and regulations describing or for that particular local government. I think that create those special purpose authorities were also created under the organic law, sort of where different communities like the Botu, or there's provisions for them to make their own laws and regulations around how they could organize themselves. So that principle, if you look at that principle, that sort of says, what are the things that you could do on your own? And then let's enable that through some legislative mechanisms that gives you that, and continue that.
From what I understand, and I want to talk specifically about the first organic law on provincial governments, and we'll dive into how that was implemented at that time. So, but as an example for our viewers, when you talk about national functions or national responsibilities, what comes to mind initially is like national security, the army, right? The police force, foreign affairs. Those are national responsibilities. But then you come to province, you'll have the provincial concerns, and then you come to district concerns. That's what I understand. The district level, or like a local urban council, fixing the potholes. There's a bridge broken or the parks or something. That's the local council's responsibility. The national government stays out of it. Anyway, but I wanted to, you can speak to that as well, but Mr. Tamutai and Mr. Pokawin, in terms of the, I guess, practitioners of the 1976 organic law, which existed till 1995, give us a highlight or some of the highlights of how that organic law was implemented. What was the provincial government like at that time? Because for us young people, we are aware of this current system now. I was telling all of you at different moments in time that my earliest memory of a provincial government, a pre-1995 provincial government, was in Wewak. When I was a kid, 1994, 1995 itself, where I observed the provincial works department. That was like the coolest thing in Wewak town. Where you drive by the provincial works department, you see all the yellow trucks, the yellow machines, and when we travel up to Maprik on the weekends or to the highway, you see those yellow trucks working on the roads, fixing the bridges and the potholes. And I think since the reform, obviously, it's not very effective. Now we have contractors on the highway rather than the provincial works department vehicles. But between 1976 and 1995, you had this system where, like when I started coming to understanding how governments work in high school and so on, I used to hear about former premier and former this and that. And I had no idea, because I knew that we had a governor. And so where was this premier? What was he or her? What was his functions and powers? How did the provincial assembly work? Maybe we can speak to some of that historical information. Who would like to take this first?
Let me start it off. Mr. Tamutai mentioned about all these things relates to making decisions, autonomy, making decisions, and the power to make decisions. Who has the power to make what decisions? The Constitution makes it very clear. As Dr. Webster said, during the first provincial government system, we have three clear powers: national government powers, as you mentioned, and then provincial government powers, and the concurrent powers. Concurrent powers, basically, both governments have the authority to make laws there, but they have to either consult in order for, if provincial governments wants to make a law in that particular area, which is under concurrent arrangements, it consults with the national government.
Sorry, practically, how does that concurrent process work? There's a meeting or a committee?
It's stated in law.
Okay.
It's stated in law. So if I want to go into that area, I consult with the national government. If there is and of course, if national government has that authority, that law that national government has made prevails over the provincial government law. But where it is with the power has been given to provincial government, national government cannot touch. But the current provincial governments have come up with a very smart idea. And basically, it's this. You asked the question earlier on, what powers? At the moment, you go through the organic law, and the organic law makes very clear that these are the powers of provincial governments. And when you count them, it's about 27 or so. Clear areas, which is stated. Local level governments have about 33. Actual areas where local governments have authority over. And national government has specific powers, as you have identified. But at the same time, it states that where it is in the national interest, national government can even make laws that it has already granted to provincial governments or to local level governments. Or if provincial governments feels that this area, which is not under itself, but it cannot perform, it can give it back to national government to carry it out on its behalf, or to local level government to do it on its behalf. Similarly, with national government and so on. But we'll link these to two things. One, okay, the power to make decisions. But then you go into the arrangements, and who makes those decisions? Who makes those decisions? So you look at the structure that has been created to implement the system. Like the current one, as I mentioned a bit earlier, the people who makes this decision at the national government are members of parliament. You go to provincial governments, and the people who had the decisions to be made by the provincial government is the national government through the governor, who is the provincial member of parliament. And you go to LLG, and it is made with the leadership of the chairman or the president, who is a member of the provincial assembly. And then these same people with the 1994 interventions, 1914 interventions, it is the same people who are in the provincial assembly who are making decisions for the LLGs in the districts. So the power to make decisions, but then who makes those decisions? And when you look at it, Momi says we have returned to where it was before.
Because you end up with, these are national leaders.
Yeah, and they are very, very powerful at the provincial and the local level government.
Yeah, because the MP is the chairman of the DDA.
Correct.
Yeah.
And provincial governments.
MPs are also members of the Provincial Assembly.
In other words, on paper, it says the district shall make decisions for the district, but the actual people there, they are the national leaders.
So that's where Momis talks about centralization.
Like you're saying, who's making the decision? The content of the decision makers is the same person.
Correct.
From parliament, from national level, provincial level, the DDA,
And right down to
the
wards.
LLGs, yeah. Down to, yeah.
But when you look at it, you go back to the original CPC, and CPC talks about a unitary system of government. Unitary system of government. And you go to the Constitution, and the Constitution says the power, authority, and jurisdiction of the people is exercised by the national government. And the national government is made up of the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. And when you link all this together, what we are seeing is a form of a unitary system of government.
Unitary meaning?
That's the whole point. What does it mean? And what it means is that the original power has been given to the national government.
A single entity, a unit, one unit.
And then it has created a system of decentralization which it controls.
Similar to a colonial
It controls.
Okay.
But at the same time, who is in that government? It's you, it's I. We are in that government. Not Australia. It's Papua New Guineans. And who made it happen? We elected them. And we made those laws.
Reminds me of the Catholic Church, like Father, God, and the Holy Spirit.
Correct.
But it's just one God.
Correct. That's it. But, sorry, we may be...
Sorry.
But this is the whole thing. You see, it is a design, like anything else. We design the road system. And in order for the contractor to be given, there are supervisors who are determining whether or not the construction follows the design. And the system of government similarly, the 1976, 77 one, did we follow the design? And then the 1995 one, 1995, 97, 1995 interim arrangement, 97, the actual substantive provincial government comes in. Until now, have we followed the design? And then whilst we are doing that, an intervention came in. And in fact, DDA, the name is different. But it is accommodated for in the 1995 organic law under the Joint District Planning and Budget Priorities Committee. That's the name it has.
Abolished.
It was repealed and replaced by the District Development Authority, but the content is the same. Except that we have the District Development Authority Act, which gave DDA the teeth that it did not have before. So the design is then reflected in the District Development Authority Act. It creates the board, it creates the administrative authority, which is made up of the governor and all these people, and they put into place the mechanism that implement the roles and functions of Joint District Planning and Budget Priorities Committee, which is now being done by District Development Authority. But then it gives the definition of the District Development Authority in the minds of those who made it. It's just an implementer, an implementation mechanism within the respective provinces, but in the district. So the beauty of DDA is that it goes right through to the districts. Previously, you have the provincial governments, and then it goes down to LLGs. And the district is a huge area. The DDA now brings a lot of money into the districts. But then it had redesigned the system of 1995. Before national government, and this is where we were when we had the premier system, let's just say that for convenience purposes. When we had the premier system, it was a new arrangement. So the provincial governments were reliant on provincial affairs. We connect with provincial affairs in order to get things done and so on. And the other departments were basically, we go through them, to them through provincial affairs. But now each provincial government goes direct anywhere. Provincial affairs now has been made almost redundant. And when we look at what provincial affairs is doing, it may be doing everything else or nothing. Because provincial governments are doing their own thing. They have their own legal officers. They have their own engineers. They can access anywhere. And with the new system, they can even have private companies to do all their work. To do all their work. So you said you don't see the yellow cars anymore. You see trucks that is owned by Pokawin and Company. So all this kind of things comes in. So my friend talks about, we went a bit out, and then we're coming back again, and maybe that is what we continue to do now. We're going out and coming in, going out and coming in.
But Mr. Tamutai, you in that premier system, how effective was it in terms of, the concern for the people right now is service delivery, our aid posts, health and education access and all that, roads so that we can get our produce to market. Paint us a picture of how effective it was for the provincial governments pre-1995 under the premier system in terms of delivering that service, and if it was effective, why was it effective?
Right. The 1976 organic law, although was not perfect, but it was on track to bring the decision-making powers to the people. So when you go through the organic law and we talk about the legislative powers, like the primary, there was a primary area of legislation for the provincial government, where when a provincial government passes a law on that subject, and that is like the primary subjects were like mobile trading, if I can recall, alcohol, education, some of those areas. Then the national government should not step in to pass any legislation. But now in the new organic law, if the national government passes a law, then it overrides that of the provincial government. So
You didn't have that kind of
no,
provision in the old one?
it was sort of the old organic law was was embracing the concept of autonomy, and it was driving that. That is why the organic law was set up in a way that the provincial government was exercising decision-making powers. So you had the provincial constitution and all that. And there was accountability. Accountability, when you look at a bigger picture, the provincial, the premier was elected from the province, and then the constituent members, they were all elected, and they had their own assembly set up. And in the assembly, the premier is taken into account for how he's going to run the government, the budget, everything. So you had, they had unofficial opposition and government within the assembly too. So there was, check and balance, all this. So now I see that the concept of accountability, even by the national government, has decimated. Now, if the provincial governments were in existence, they would take the national government on task on issues. Now they cannot, because the governor, he may be in the ruling party. He's in the ruling party, so his power is emasculated. It's sort of he cannot say much. But when the premier and the Constitutional Assembly and that provincial government was then, it was an independent body of its own. It can say things for the consent of the province that now the governor cannot speak for. So you get a big oil project, for instance, coming up now. The governor will be likely to agree to what the type of developer that has to come in. He would be likely to agree with the prime minister because he is of the same party. And I see this happening.
So just to be clear, the premier wasn't a member of the national parliament.
No, he was
at
not.
that time, and all the constituent members, they were not members of
no.
parliament, national parliament.
No.
They were elected representatives.
They will.
They didn't have the dual role or the two hats.
No.
Members of parliament were like unofficial, what do you call it? Ex officio.
Ex officio.
And how much power did they have in the provincial assembly?
They did.
They didn't have any powers.
They just went and observed.
They went and observed, but they didn't speak to the issue.
No.
They can speak,
Yeah.
they cannot vote,
They cannot
Yeah.
vote.
they cannot even come up with an agenda.
And
They can't give instruction
yes.
at that time.
Yeah. And then they were driving their budget. The provincial government was driving its budget.
Yeah.
The grants were given. There were 5 grants. The minimum unconditional grant, the additional grant, I suppose, derivation grant, the tax powers, their tax
You
powers.
make yourself.
Yes, and the one you make yourself. So, as I said in the opening, that it was, even though it was not perfect, it was driving towards autonomy. And then it was supposed to be, as Pokawin has stated, you should earn it rather than what. But then, because everybody wanted it, we tried to, adjust to the organic law and try to drive that autonomy concept. So that was how it was, and there was transparency, there was accountability. So you don't, you talk about contracts and all this. The premiers were very, very powerful. Now, we wouldn't have the change in the Petroleum Act. We wouldn't have the change in the Mining Act and getting more benefits for the province if there was not this provincial government system. Because I was part of I was with Southern Highlands at that time when we were driving the petroleum and the mining too. I was coordinating with the provincial legal officer of Enga. He was doing the Pogra bit. I was doing the Kutubu. So the provincial government had the initiative, the energy to fight. Now there is no energy, no initiative.
But explain that time, like in terms of how you guys were fighting and everything. How did that look like in terms of your dealings with the national government?
Negotiating and all that.
Like how did that? Like national government couldn't do what they wanted. They had to come and speak to you guys. Explain that.
They explain. We had the regional councils. We had the national premiers councils, which were more powerful. Now you talk about the national governors council. I don't believe in that. I think back of the past years, and I don't believe in what they do. They say all sorts of things. Like now they said they want to drive this, look at the reforms and what do we do and all that, and no one is really speaking about it.
Well, I put to Governor Bird in my first interview with him, I said, why can't the governors get together and push for these certain reforms? And his answer was in effect that they cannot, because they have all these loyalties that are there that they have to entertain, and then they can't be really united. And that's where I see the problem with wearing two hats comes in really as a major issue, because the governors, if they were serious about bringing back powers to the provincial government, they could get together and push for some of these reforms that we are talking about, return to the pre-1995, at least to some extent, give it back autonomy. But it seems like they're emasculated because they all have all these loyalties and two hats to wear. And
I think it's really in the organic law. The organic laws, that's the distinction between the other ordinary laws. In worldwide, they call it the entrenchment. Yeah. Where you entrench the law so that the national government, you cannot sort of simply change it. In the previous 1976 Act, you have the conditional grants that you're saying. The MUGs, this was the grant to pay the salaries of the public servants, to deliver health and education and so on. It was set in the 1976 sort of budget parameters. So the national government could not give anything less than that. It was set. The additional bits were negotiated for projects and so on, and so that came under the National Public Expenditure Plan or the development budget. So you could get additional funds. So provinces had their grants sort of fixed. Yeah. And then the additional grants could come from the national government. They could raise it through their own taxation measures. They were empowered to do that. So the organic law provided for that. They primarily provincial functions.
The 76 organic.
76 organic law. So they could do that. As Matthew has pointed out, in the premiers, the executive government had to present the budget, the annual budget on the assembly. The assembly approves it, then it's factored into the accounting system and they implement it. The premier then has to deliver reports. If there's a project in a particular area in the province, there are provincial members say, hey, we approve this budget, this thing is not happening. Where is my school? Where is my road? And so on. So there's a better accountability in the management and expenditure of funds in that. It's more transparent because it was local, people knew what was happening. At this point in time, the provincial budgets are passed, but the provincial assembly has no idea how it's implemented because the governor brings it to Waigani, presents it to the treasurer, they can make the changes and the amendments there, and then it's implemented. You have no sort of responsibility to report back to the provincial assembly. In the same way, the districts, they are spending money, whereas they really can't sort of vouch for the accountability. We have no accountability mechanisms in place. They might file a report to a department or government, but on the ground, the beneficiaries can't hold the person accountable. The provincial legislative bodies were really accountable mechanisms that we created, very effective in the way that they had oversight on the fund. And then at the end of the year, the governor then or the premier presented a report on the implementation of the budget and the following year's budget. So clear accountability mechanisms in terms of that, I think. And I lived through that period of the way, and I was a primary school teacher teaching. The roads were well maintained in Western Highlands, which covered Juaka. All the other provinces, I think, can also say that the services were well provided under that particular arrangement.
Yeah, I met a local councillor or president or whatever it was called back then. He was under the 76 organic law president. He came to my office a couple of weeks ago and we chatted, and he was talking about he intends now to run again under the new system as a local, the local member or something. And he was saying how at that time, as a constituent president or something he was called in Gulf province, that he was responsible for the maintenance of 5 airstrips in his local constituency. And he was responsible for the 5 airstrips, and they were always in good condition because he would always have access to money to send to, some of them were run by the churches, but he'll send them money when there was maintenance needed and so on. And he was talking about back in those days he used to do that, and I asked him, well, how are those airstrips now? And he said, they're all run down, they're all not existent. And so you can see underground effects of this new system that we've created, that the underground development isn't working.
But David, what you find is that under the current arrangement, there's a lot of money.
We've got more money now than we've ever had before.
The combination of provincial government and district development authority, you are talking about millions and millions of money. During our days, we had a lot of money under that arrangement, but the numbers is not the same as what we have now.
Sure.
The numbers at that time was very, very small compared to what we have now.
2 million.
We have a lot of money. Then you ask the question, what really is the problem? And maybe it's a question of what we do with that money. Are we doing it rightly, or there are factors which intervenes that makes it difficult to even have that amount of money available?
Well, it comes back to your question, who's making the decisions? Who has the power to make the decisions?
That is basically, I think, the design of the system is there. And theoretically, it looks good. Practically, it needs to be implemented.
Well, I think theoretically it has some problems as well.
I would disagree with you, Stephen. I think structurally it's defective. The whole system is defective.
I was going to ask you, because you were premier at one stage and then you were governor at one stage, like what was your experience in terms of the power you had to really see development happen in the province in the premier days as opposed to your governor days?
Well, I cannot say too much about the current arrangements. I was there for 1 term only, 1 and a bit term. But during that time, it was like a transitional period between what it was previously. Like previously, for anybody to reach a school, you don't need to walk over 20 minutes and you are in one school. Or you have access to an 8-post, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, and the 8 posts were staffed, and they were also provided with medicine.
Okay, so now the question on that is, who was responsible for staffing the 8 posts and for providing the medicine? Was it the provincial government
you see, this
or
is
the national government?
This is where we go back to the administrative structure. The administrative structure. Health and education, from the very beginning, were very cooperative in decentralizing their services to provincial governments. So there was like a collaboration between the provincial governments and the National Health Department and national government in terms of delivery of health services. So they divided with what is national, what is provincial, and provincial is responsible for what goes into the provinces. So that was, now they said that thing was not working, so they have now come up with, I think, Provincial Health Authority or something, which basically takes charge of both rural as well as health, urban or whatever it is, provincial. So, and we have the same lot of staff who basically assumed responsibilities, and I tell you, these guys were really workhorses. They moved. At the moment, you cannot move unless you have your allowance. At that time, even there was no allowance. They go there to deliver services. But when you come to Port Moresby, very easy to come to Port Moresby. But to go to the rural areas is too difficult to go to the areas, because even though the road goes there, but what else fuels you to go there? So in a way, structurally, and at the same time, I think much depends on the commitment that we have to get things done. And I don't want to say this, but I think politics has basically played a very important part in the actual delivery of services, whether the services are delivered or not, and when the decision can easily be changed. Why should I, as a public servant, waste my time on getting things done when we know very well that it will be changed tomorrow? So it has, I think, grown over time. So eventually, you mean not going to waste time, me. And tomorrow I'll come send this email. You mean wait tomorrow. Probably come through. And if they come, we go. If they don't come, we don't go. It seems to me, observing from outside, like let me say in my part of the world, for example, what we thought of setting up a little town on the western end of the province, we started a long time ago, and now it's been achieved now under the current arrangements. And at the same time, they're linking the road, which we have been talking about for a long time. Now the Chinese company is there trying to connect, and they can connect it within a very few, it's not big, it's about 90 kilometers or something. They can achieve it very quickly. But then we get into the problem of materials. Materials like what? Like carnas, for example. At the moment, for us to get access to a carnas, it takes you about maybe 60 to 80 kilometers for one truck to go there and come back again. One truck of carnas. New Island, for example, it's on the side of the road. You just go there, get it, and it's already on the road. So there are many other factors that's contributing. And to do that now, people have become so smart that everything now costs money. Before, we want service. Just give us give us at 8%, all our needs will be met. Now, you give them the 8%, and after a while, they say, oh, thank you, True. You just will come, they bring somebody come up behind. No, we want something higher, and so on. So needs change as times change. But it goes back to the design of the system and the commitment to get that system working. Like you talks about autonomy and so on. I think, was it 1995? Or no, 2015. A 2015 report of the CPC report. And not CPC, CLRC together with Provincial Affairs. They want the current system to be removed and replaced with a new system. And the new system will combine some features of the first system and some features of the new system, but creating a new system which will create new opportunities. Up until now, 2015, until now, nothing has happened to it.
And so I'm trying to think about now, like what were the drivers of the 1995 reforms? Because that the drivers of the 1995 drivers as in motivations ended up with 1995 reforms, and this is what we have now. And what are the differences, like in terms of the motivations for 1995 versus where's the motivation for now? Like why are we not, or powers that be, wanting the kind of change that will actually bring service to our people?
Okay, let me respond to your question from the perspective that I was at that time. At that time, from the Islands region, I led the Islands region to oppose that. Basically because we felt that yes, we may have made errors, but we have also improved and allow us to continue to improve. We had our own fight different systems in terms of what you call it, retail sales tax and so on. We began to combine it so that we only have one law that applies to all the 5 provinces in the region. So there's one training, everything is one. So we're going towards that. We had Bougainville. It was the only one which had the premier elected directly by the people, and then Manus came in, East New Britain came in, and New Ireland was coming in, and West New Britain was coming in, combining the system. What we saw then, you said, what was the driving factor? At that 1995, from our perspective, the driving factor was the contention between the national leadership and provincial government leadership. Because provincial government leadership were becoming very, very strong. And some of them were becoming very effective. Some of them were not so effective. In fact, I should mention, the first ever provincial government to be suspended under the old system was Enga. The second one was Manus. We were the first and second provincial governments to be suspended.
What was the official reason for that?
We didn't manage the money properly, we stole the money, we did not deliver, depending. But for some of us, for Manus itself, I think, I don't know about Enga, but for Manus, it rose over 30,000 kina of what would we claim as misappropriation. Wow. 30,000.
Basically, a lot of it to do with the personality difference between the national politicians and the provincial politicians.
And then it became quite popular. Like a lot of provincial governments went through this process of being suspended.
That's correct.
Yeah,
and
I remember that. Yeah.
Now there's none. They tried with Southern Highlands.
Well, because now the national government has more power than it did before.
Now they're happy.
Now they're happy. It's like, these guys are not going to mess with us. We leave them
That's
alone.
what I was saying. That you asked about the driving factor. What was the driving factor? And the problem was the successes of leadership being developed from the provincial level. And they even contest elections and they win.
They use it as a platform for the national elections if they intend to
They
come.
didn't use it as a platform. It's a natural growth.
Right. Yeah.
The birthright. The birthright.
And it's basically you develop your leadership as you go along.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then it becomes like a threat.
Yeah.
That's, from my mind, it's a 1995 factor.
So the 1995 organic law was an ego-driven reform.
It was a lot of the academic research, I mean, that was done by NRI researchers at that time. They point to that, saying really there was the level of corruption or the stealing and so on is, so small that compared to current times. Manageable, yeah. It could have been fixed in more administratively and so on, but there's political differences. The provincial governments were so effective in their service delivery that the people sort of appreciate the provincial politicians as deliverers of basic services. And the national MPs came around for campaigning. They would say, "And what do you do?" I mean, clearly.
So they felt irrelevant.
Yeah, people at that time could not understand the fact that the national members of parliament made laws covering the whole country, and they were, they had different roles to play. Right. They saw them as, government MPs as deliverers of basic service, and the provincial politicians were very effective. They looked after the roads, the bridges, the aid posts, the schools, the problems that the people had. They were there. So that's where the national MPs felt that they were being outdone by the MPs. So they said, now how do we get rid of this? And that's clearly in the language of Wing Ti, and he was the prime minister at that time. That is in the language of Sir Julius Chen when he was the prime minister, and he was the one who oversaw the whole thing. He said at that time, now
he's saying something different because he's a governor now.
But at that time he said, now we've at least got rid of the government that was a problem for us. Right. But they were very effective, and I think for countries around the world, two things. One is that each level of government, there's 3 tiers or 2 levels of government, they need to be elected, and each separate legislative assembly, because that becomes better representation, better accountability. You look at Australia, the local level government, the members are elected by the community. State government, a separate assembly, and then the national level, every other sort of country. We have a problem where we have the national MPs at the local level, at the provincial level, at the national level.
And sorry, can I add to not only representation and accountability, but participation everyone's participation at each of those levels of government.
Yes, yeah.
How are we a part of it in terms of?
And that
the
doesn't
work
bring
that-
about better accountability. Now, each of them are complicit in the way that the finances are mismanaged or rules are, they are, so there's no accountability. I think when you have independently elected MPs, they can have their independent accountability at the lower level, at the middle level, and then at the national level. And as Matthew pointed out, even the discrepancies between national and provincial levels or at the local level government, they can sort of hold each other to account for their actions as well. At the moment, we don't have good accountability. Now, we also have a lack of, it's also affecting the performance of the national parliament. That there is, because the members of parliament are now being involved at the district level, at the provincial level, there's a lack of accountability by national parliament itself. In the 1976 period, we have people like Warren Dutton, who was the chairman of the Public Accounts Committee. He would call up the Secretary for Works, say, what happened? This bridge was under our budget, under the budget that's approved by Parliament. When is it going to be implemented? The different secretaries, they were held to account for the implementation of the budget. The committees were really working because that was the job of the members of parliament. They represented the people, they elected the executive government, they held the executive government to account in their roles as representatives of the people at the national level, at the national parliament. Now their roles have, we have no accountability of the executive government. They're not, so the performance of the members of parliament are being affected by the other thing that, interestingly, I mentioned too, that our members of parliament are being overworked. They're really trying to do all the three levels. And either they're not doing it well, and so we are sort of, weakened performance at all these levels, or they are being so overworked that many of them are dying. They're suffering from ill health and,
There is one thing that, in the past, there was no selective, expenditures. Now you see the governors, they select who should be paid under the budget because it's not accountable. There is no provincial assembly there to take him into account. So it's like the national government, members doing here, the provincial government also does that. And then you extend it to the DDA. So they have unilateral powers to spend whatever, and they are the working money now. And it has now, in some of our provinces now, they've changed the mindset of the people to believe in a governor and a member of parliament as the handout machine, or ATM machine. So, and then you promote the idea of cronyism. In the past, there was never cronyism when I was working with the provincial government. The premier cannot have his cronies come and dictate to him what tender projects and all this. He is accountable to the provincial assembly. The provincial assembly members will question him. They will say, what are you doing with this money? Where is this money going? So everything was done.
They're in the province, so they can see everything.
They can see everything. It was transparent.
Yeah.
Transparency was there. And then you have the Auditor General, who I believe, maybe Pokawin may say something there, but in the Southern Islands, for instance, every year they were auditing the books. So, when you talk about the suspension provision, one of the good grounds was this gross financial mismanagement, which was abused to an extent, but it was a good ground of suspension. So that was all the time over the head of the provincial government and the premier. So premier is taken to task that someone is overlooking, supervising what I'm doing now. So the supervisory power of the national government was then implemented. And when I say that, you see the provincial affairs department was very effective that time too. Now we have plasma, but plasma has no teeth. At that time, you have, even within the provincial affairs department, you had investigative, personals in there who go down to the provinces to investigate and see that the system was working. Now, believe it or not, even some governors can dictate the budget to their own liking, bring it down and get a treasurer who is in the same party as him to just approve it, and it goes through. But where is decision making and power of decision making for a province when you have a treasurer, a one-man person here, who is going to say yes or no to a budget? In Waigani. So that has brought us completely astray into a quagmire. We have, and if I may, I can say further to what we are saying, about this subjugation and all that, I think it's unconstitutional. Because if you go back to section 187C, you will see subsection 4.5 there. The organic law is supposed to provide for a devolution of powers, decision making, substantial powers of decision making. So when you talk about the new reforms now, the 1995 reform, it in a way militates against that. It's derogatory to that provision. But it is a matter of someone really taking it, really testing it. But who will test it out? Everybody is enjoying it. So, but when we are talking, when in our discussion, I can see that, the intention of the Constitution is still alive. But the structure that we have put in place through the 1995 reforms and now the 2014 intervention or whatever in the DDA, which is also an unconstitutional body because it is not an elective body, because a body must be an elective body. You cannot have indirect people, participating in making decisions again. So all these things, these are the legal aspects of it.
And the problem with DDAs is the local level government councils still exist. And the LLGs have their responsibilities for, serving the people. But you have the DDAs coming and there's like two bodies now responsible for almost the same things, if I understand it correctly.
Yeah, and the DDAs, some of the funds are coming from the provincial budget that normally would go to a province. It's going to the district. And some of the funds that would go to the local level governments are also going to the districts.
So it's bypassing the provincial.
And then some of the funds that would go under the National Planning Department, under the development budget, they're also going to the district. Like, for instance, the SMEs, the projects that are funded through the national development budget, rather than going to the government departments or through the provincial governments or through the LLGs, now they're going through the DDAs. And so a greater increases in the allocations to the DDAs are coming about. It's not just the 5 million or the 10 billion grant, but there are other activities. And so that's funds that are as limited accountability in terms of what are the decisions on where it's being spent, how it's spent. So I think that's overall there's a lack of oversight and accountability.
Like if I can add on to, like you mentioned about how you managed how the provincial assembly managed a mining company coming into the province and those arrangements. Like now, for example, like with Pogar opening up again, so the approvals that need to be done. So basically, we've got we have our FX issues and everything, foreign exchange issues, and so we need to get government in. I mean, we need to get our mining projects up and running for the revenue of the nation and so forth. So while the need and demand is there, this goes back to how the system has been complicated because of who's driving it, which then again limits them and overworks these members of parliament. So for the mining now, like with Pogar opening up again, you've got the approved proposal for development. There's the mining contract. There's the benefit sharing MOA, and then there's the compensation agreements for moving people or if they cut down the trees and so forth. And then now they've introduced another layer of agreement that needs to come in is the community development agreement. So it's like all of these, that's like 4 or 5 agreements that they need to get through just for that mining for that mine to start and everything. And all of these agreements have money attached to them. So it's like, again, where's the accountability? Like outside of the issues that we're saying that the structures have been disfigured and morphed into some sort of strange creature that we don't recognize. Then we got a whole lot of these other things happening too, with these mining agreements. So just adding on that, that it's turning very ugly.
And Emmanuel, you pointed that, but these are the internal things. We have international commitments, environment, to the global community. Yes. Our members of parliament are now focused so on the internal bits, what's happening within the district, that we've forgotten that we live in a global environment that we have an obligation to, make laws and be part of. And so I see a lot of the ministers who should have the responsibility, they also have, they're thinking more of the elections. Politicians, their main objective is to win the next election.
All right, I have a final question, not final question, coming to the end of the whole discussion. I want to get from each of you, we've kind of identified a lot of the issues or the problems, the challenges. In our minds or in your mind, what's the ideal structure that we should have? Is it the 76 organic law or a bit of the 76 and a 95 or a completely new one? Or is there a model we can copy from some other country? What's the way forward now? Say, if the entire new reform was based on these 5 gentlemen sitting at this table, what would be the key things that we would put forward? Maybe we go around the table, Mr. Pokawin, and then go around this way.
In my mind, the options are already available to us. We don't have to go look for it. But we must be prepared to implement it. Okay, we started off with 76, 77 model. Then we came with 1995 model. And that model had already been revamped with the 2014 intervention with DDA. And now you look at the IPATAS report of 2015, and IPATAS report basically say we keep the current system, but we need to tweak it, take account of the positive changes that may have taken place. It also raises the issue of DDA. How do we factor in DDA? Or we remove DDA. But we work on it. Instead of removing it, we learn from the experience that we have gained up until now and make necessary changes. And if we were to do a new organic law, that new organic law must take account of the positive changes that have taken place. And then we have the CLRC model, which basically says remove the current system with all its pluses and negatives and create a totally new system which hasn't been tried anywhere in the world. But take account of what has happened previously, bring it in, and retweet a bit Part 6A, sections 187A to 187J, to allow for, which had existed in the past, where one or the other provincial governments may decide, 2 or more, may decide to want to work together or to eventually come up with just one body. That would also be allowed. And they say that through that you can attain what Matthew has been mentioning continuously. You would then realize that autonomy, you create that. In my mind, the other model is the Part 14 model. And that's where now it applies to Bougainville. And to me, that is already part of the Constitution. And what it basically says is that it grants definite powers to provinces or to regions or to whatever category that may be created that would allow you to be autonomous. And the powers that is given to you cannot be unilaterally removed by the national government. Basically, we realize the original intention of decentralization. But we all have to be committed to the integrity and sovereignty of PNG. That is something that is untouchable. You cannot question the integrity of PNG, but you stand and govern your different units. In a way, it's like what states are really happening in a federal system of government, where they have their specific powers, they have their specific laws, they make their own laws. So their governors or whatever turn it into law. And for us, I think the actual design for future PNG has already been incorporated into the PNG Constitution now. How do we manage it and make it come into existence?
Are there DDAs in the ABG?
DDA doesn't exist.
Okay, so that's a model that we can apply to the rest of the country.
But LLGs are powerful.
Sorry, DDAs exist in Bougainville.
Okay.
Yeah. But Bougainville is a different case. If you look at it, you also have the president and you have the regional member. You have the Bougainville. So it's a bad example. I think,
As it relates to Part 14, it doesn't exist. But in terms of the combination of Part 14 and Part 6, certain portion of Part 6, like DDA, is not formally in existence, but members of parliament have that allotment as well.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Tamutai?
I want to see, as originally the CPC wanted, initiative and energy and vibrancy in the provincial government itself. One thing I do not want to see is the same person who is in the province as a premier or governor, whoever, holds the national government office also. That will entirely emasculate, with our own way of political, background, where you have, politics, the national politics can entirely, crush the person. He will not be that independent enough to make his decision. I want to see a more independent body still in the province, as before, in 1976, where they have their own budget and they make their own decisions. It's all about decision making, bringing back the decision making powers back to the province, and maybe have our constituencies again. Yeah. So each constituency has a constituent member, and that brings back accountability, transparency. So everybody's watching each other's back, and check balance is working. That's democracy now. If we have to, what we have done is, with a new reform, we have subdued democracy to an extent. So democracy and democratic principles will only be exercised properly when a person has the power to make a decision for himself, according to his own conscience and his own environment. Yeah. So that. I'm more or less leaning towards the old system, so to speak. But we can give and take and try to see. But I definitely do not want to see the same person in the province again in the national government. Yeah, because he'll still be answerable to the Prime Minister, and I don't like that. In the past, the premiers were not answerable to any Prime Minister. They, in fact, dictated the politics of Papua New Guinea to an extent. And even party politics, that's one thing we didn't mention, but party politics was, strong at that time, because the provincial members were members of parties, and if they see a good party, they support that party, and they make sure that the party wins the election. So that was very healthy for elections and all that. And now, if we go back, another thing that I see is we got an electoral process where it's very defective now. So if we bring back this system where their provincial constituency assembly members are being elected, they would have some control and say in the way that we have the common roll and the voters, the election process. Because at the moment, the national MPs have their own way, and they manipulate the provincial affairs department to create a lot of council wards, and that is how they inflate And this is happening in the highlands especially, and I know that. They create more council wards with, names, fake names and all that. And that's how they are getting all the elections done and all that. And we can curtail election fraud and all that. If we still have the system where provincial government members are also elected, they will also have control over their voters. That's what I'm trying to say. So in that way, one member of the parliament cannot, or one candidate for that matter, cannot come and really bulldoze his own agenda at the time of polling and all that.
Thank you. Dr. Webster?
Thank you. I guess two things that, going back to the old provincial government system, I mean, it's having elected representatives at different levels of government and those different levels of government being given clear areas of responsibility. At the moment, we really don't know who's responsible. I go to the village and say, who's responsible for this? I am a member of council or provincial government or national government. Having the clear demarcation of responsibilities, you know who to hold into account for basic service delivery, and so that leads to better management of resources. The second issue is around the allocation of funds. We have a two-level system, 20 provinces. You allocate those funds. You have the Auditor General going in and auditing the funds and having all these accountability mechanisms work and supervisory mechanisms work. You have how many districts, how many provincial governments, how many LLGs. There's limited accountability in those. The auditors cannot go down and audit those reports. You don't have the accountability mechanism in terms of the elected MPs holding each other to account. And so I'd prefer the old system and having those funds allocated to a few entities that can better manage and do that. But at the same time, I think we really need to review the organic law and have an organic law that entrenches those responsibilities. And so when I hear the governors now talking about the block grants and so on, you can have a block grant, yes, but then the next government might come in and say, no, we remove that. So whatever is agreed to, you need to agree and then have it and entrench in an organic law that sort of make sure that you get the funds without it.
I think that's what Governor Bird is talking about, entrenching the block grants in constitutional law. Yeah.
But having said that, the program that I was leading, we were looking at saying what are the areas, and so there are a number of reviews, as Stephen pointed out. As soon as the 1995 organic law was passed, the enabling legislations were not passed, and then people had problems with all kinds of, they were already dissatisfied. So a number of reports from CLRC led to the CLRC and DPLG. In 2009, the late Lawrence Kalanai, when he was the director of CLRC, they led an investigation and say, is it working, is it not working? So dissatisfaction with the 95 system merged as soon as it was implemented. So there's a whole lot of, and then other reviews, IPDA's report and so on. So we reviewed all of that and we said, look, there's a number of proposals that come through, but clearly what we need to look at is like initially 5 and now 8 areas and said representation. What sort of level of representation do we want? How do we allocate responsibilities? Which responsibilities to these levels of government? Along with that, how do you allocate financing? What are the mechanisms of financing? And then the public servants. How do you organize the public servants to implement that public servant? Then what are the laws that will now make sure that that framework that we agree to is now put in place, and then and whether it's simple laws, organic law, and so on. And then the final thing is implementation. A lot of these things, we never implemented the first reform, 76, properly. We were still in the middle of it when we were dissatisfied, and then we said, out it goes.
Oh, okay.
And then 1995, before we even implemented the enabling legislation is not passed, and it's not only we said, no, we're not happy, we want to pass it. So reforms in Italy and a number of places that I've looked at and so on, it's taken them 25, 50 years to implement a reform. So whatever we agree to, that framework that we agree to, We need to go the long haul and say, look, we planned and say, this is in year 1, we're going to do this in year 2, and the 3, 4, 5, and so on. And it's a work in progress. Yeah, it's a work in progress. So those are, from our report, we said these are the 8 things that we need to capture in any way we go forward, reform into the future for decentralized system of government. This is the framework. And so we were very happy when the member for, the government appointed a bipartisan parliamentary committee with the governor from Morobe as the chair. We're happy to take through this and say, look, let's look at the framework and see how we can reorganize our government in terms of. But then now, it's the political disarray and the technical team that we put together to work on it. We're waiting. So I think I'm hoping that this 50th anniversary, we really, this is an opportunity to review our constitution and go look at the constitution and say, what does the constitution say about enabling the better governance system, a decentralized, effective, where the people, their responsibilities are given back to the people to decide on which areas of services that they want to make their decisions.
Sorry, can you list those eight areas?
Yes, I've got them. Yeah, it's in our report that.
Okay.
I'll
not
give
off the top of your head.
Yeah, not the top.
Okay.
But I just mentioned that.
Okay,
yeah.
no problem.
The political representation. Yeah, at which level? National, provincial, and then at the local level government. How do we elect those people, and what sort of arrangements do you have? The next bit is around the powers. Sort of what powers do these different levels of government? What are the responsibilities that they should have? The third is around funding arrangements. How do you finance that? And what are the agreements for financing? And then the public service arrangements. Like India, they have sort of a national public service, but at this, we have a national public service, but we also say we are a provincial government. So how do you now arrange for that? Do you want to have mixed, or do you want to have a provincial government sort of what are the public service administrative arrangements? And I think the fifth one is around the laws. What sort of laws will capture those arrangements? And then the final, I'm missing one, I'm forgetting which, but the most important one, which I missed out from my initial terms but there's a professor for constitutional law in Melbourne University. He came up and said, look, implementation is an issue and said, you're spot on, because we failed in that. So you draw up an implementation plan. How are you going to implement that reform over time? And it's a long haul. And my experience in Italy, there's a region in Italy that was given autonomy powers in 1974. And I used them as an expert from that region, an institute that did the monitoring on the implementation of the autonomy arrangements to come and help in the Bougainville sort of analysis. And I asked them and said, as the autonomy sort of implementation is complete, I said, no, it's work in progress. It's 50 years, but it's work in progress.
Forever. So long as you have human beings, it continues to be work in progress.
We don't know how to think that long term, or act long term. Yeah, none of what we have done has ever pointed to some sort of 50-year, 100-year plan for a goal to get there. Yeah.
The 1976 organic law was putting it on traction on the railroad track, and we were going on the railroad track, and suddenly this
we derailed ourselves.
Yeah, derailed ourselves.
Yeah. What about you, Manu? What are your thoughts? Like, just listening to all this gentleman, what would be at least one thing that you'd like to see?
Yeah, exactly. I'm not knowledgeable enough to give some sort of conclusive answer or solution, but I think what I'm getting from our distinguished speakers, I think the main thing is accountability. I think for me I feel that's probably the key thing, or that I understand. In terms of accountability, being voted to make decisions at your level of government, whether it's in the village or the ward or the local level government, I think those bodies need to be voted in to be accountable for the decisions they're making. So I think that's what I'm getting from the speakers. And I guess the only comment I'd add on to that is, in today's world of technology, we're not it's not like the East India Company being in India for 300 years and they're doing everything, writing a pen and then sending the letter on a ship and taking a year to get back to India, to the London or UK, to the Queen. It's like we have all the technology now. I'm probably being biased from my industry, but we have all the technology now to do it. So it's just so for me, I'd see that level of accountability would be a great way to move. Yeah. I guess if we just can find the political will.
Yeah, I think that's it. That's political will. But yeah, well, thank you, gentlemen. We're out of time, but I appreciate all the thoughts and comments so far. And my hope is that, you know, from our discussions, people listening out there, at least getting interested. And I've started thinking, well, after the John Momis interview and after I came to see Dr. Webster and then you gentlemen, I think this is the threshold issue for Papua New Guinea, to be honest. Like, if we fix up decentralization and the devolution of powers, we will fix up this country and everything else that people complain about, especially in terms of service delivery. Then they'll get service delivered. But right now, because we have all these muddled up systems and accountability, implementation issues, we don't know who's responsible for what. Our parliamentarians are not long-term thinking. They're trying to win the next election. So they end up being like, I like what Mr. Tamutai said, you know, we should have different people in the provincial and what you said, the representation should be sorted out, because, you know, when they're involved in all three tiers of government, they become ineffective in all three instances, national, provincial, and local. And so it's just we're shooting ourselves in the foot, so to speak, when we give them all these responsibilities. So I think it's hopefully some people out there will listen and just like, yeah, let's get interested in this. Let's talk more about this. Let's push the government. You know, they've started this bipartisan committee, but then they've left you in the wilderness, and hopefully they can pick you up again and say, okay, let's really think about this. And I would say, you know, for the ordinary citizens out there, you know, you're all putting your TikToks out and your Facebook out. Put some information out so your members of parliament can see. Yeah. Go and talk to your constituents and just say, listen, get interested in this topic and get keen about bringing in the reforms, because unless we fix this up, you know, our aid posts will not be erected, our airstrips will be run down and so on. So yeah, we just need the political will for it. But otherwise, thank you so much. It's been a very, very informative discussion, and we'll have to draw it to the close. Hopefully, maybe we'll pick it up again in another session. But thank you, Manu. I appreciate your time. Thank you, Dr. Webster. Thank you, Mr. Tamutai. And thank you, Mr. Pokawin. You all have a good rest of the day, and yeah, we'll see you next time. Thank you.